Hi everyone, welcome to the GDC Twitch channel. Once again, if you're back from earlier, welcome back. If you are new to us today, hello, my name is Brian Francis. I am a contributing editor at GammaSutra.com. I am a community manager for GDC. I am here today with a game called Remnant from the Ashes. It comes to us from, comes to us a little loud. Let me turn that down. Comes to us from Gunfire Games out of Austin, Texas. And in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, I am joined by the design director of Remnant, and that would be John Pearl. John, how are you doing?
Doing good.
Great. Thank you for joining us today, John. For those of you who are new to the channel, there are two things you should know. One, if you have questions for John, we will be taking them in Twitch chat, and we would love to answer your questions. Two, I have a new kitten. Who may wander by and start squeaking like she just did. So if you hear her, know that she is she's just very concerned and wants to play with her parent human. But I cannot do that because I'm streaming this game. Remnant from the Ashes is a third-person action adventure game that, from an outside perspective, feels a little bit like Dark Souls. It's got that sort of dread-based exploration and combat. There's a big emphasis on dodging, knowing the frames of your opponent's attack so you can dodge it, counter it, etc. One big design twist for me is that there's a lot more guns in this game compared to previous Soulsborne games. John, instead of letting me ramble though, how would you describe Remnant to someone who hasn't played it?
I think you did a pretty good job there. It really is. It is like we took a lot of inspirations, obviously, from the Soulsborne games, but we wanted to try to make something different, so that's why we went with shooting. Mm-hmm. And I think the big thing that really differentiates it from those games is the heavy procedural generation of the world. Mm-hmm. So we really wanted to make a co-op game that was that could be replayed a lot. Like a lot of times, if there's a third-person shooter co-op game, you kind of go through the story and you're done, and maybe there's some end-game raids or something like that. But we really wanted to focus on making a game that you can come back to. You could re-roll your world at any point, and you're going to see something new each time you play. And you play by yourself, you play with friends, you'll see different things. So that was a big part of the initial design philosophy for building the game.
That's really cool. Let's jump right into it then. For those who don't quite know this channel or what it's all about, we're here to talk about the design and development of Remnant. So we're here if you have design questions, if you have systems questions, if you have anything like that, ask away. We want to hear it. For my part, John, let's talk about the procedural design part. The idea that every time you load up a run, there's going to be different stuff in the world. What was sort of the underpinnings of that design, and what were the first steps that you and your team took to go, okay, we can implement this, even though it's a 3D world with 3D assets that have to be managed and such?
I mean, really, like it's actually. It's funny because we made a game previously called From Other Suns, which was kind of ended up being a test bed for this game in a lot of ways. It was a first-person shooter for Oculus VR, but it was based on the concept of these randomly generated tiles. It was very much more mission-focused, where you would start off on a spaceship, you jump in, and then you get to like a space station or another ship, and that ship was randomly generated. And you'd go there and you'd finish this little mission, and you go to the next one and the next one. So a lot of the tools and the ideas were kind of fleshed out there, and we wanted to make something that felt more like a real space. So that's why the worlds are a little bit more solid. So it's not just mission to mission to mission. There's missions throughout every world, but they're kind of tied a little bit closer together through the overarching story, which really doesn't change, and then the individual events that can change in between those story beats, to try to make it more of a little cohesive story that goes through these different worlds.
Right on. Building on from that, what were some other lessons you learned transitioning a set of tools and techniques that worked for VR and making them work in sort of a traditional third-person game environment?
I mean, really, like a lot of the tool sets for character movement, and as well as like the tools, the base level tools for generating the world. A lot of that came over from that game, but then we just refined over and over and over again. I think that was the biggest thing, was the amount of refinement we applied to the tools, where it would just be like, hey, let's let's add these parameters, go ahead and generate a world. It's like, this kind of stinks. Maybe we're seeing these tiles too much, and just being able to identify the repetition and feeling like it didn't have, like, it felt generic very early on, and then identifying the parts that were making it feel generic and just trying to hit these, like what we call like POI tiles, which like, oh, this looks interesting. This one's not going to repeat, or hey, with this tile always a corner tile, for example, would always repeat. Let's make a lot more of those. So really, like it's been over the entire development of it. It's been really refining the tools, the sets that we build the worlds out of, and what we can do to make the characters that inhabit that world interesting and how they move through the world as well.
Right on. Give a quick shout out in chat to Bowser Punch, who just dropped by to say it's John, and indeed it is John. John, let's dig into that. I think procedural tile sets are a big thing. A lot of developers are moving into procedural space these days, and I gotta say, I think this is one of the first third-person adventure, like kind of action adventure games. I think seriously take this in it while mixing it with such carefully driven combat. It's one of the few I've seen in this genre anyway. Usually these games tend to be a little more like fixed and handcrafted. I know the general answer is just iteration, but can you share any sort of guiding principles about when you're in there refining the tile sets and saying this one's repeating too much, this one's like this environment's repeating too much, this event, this enemy set isn't quite doing it? What were sort of the things that helped you make things more interesting so that every procedurally generated run would be different and unique as you went on? If there's anything else you could share about that.
Yeah, I think like the other thing too is the items you find in the world. Like there's obviously, like when you look at the tiles themselves, like making sure that there's a visual flow that makes sense, that the player doesn't get lost and get turned around. That's always a key thing that we had to focus on, and we refined down tiles. Sometimes they were almost too complicated, where you'd come into a building, go downstairs, like go up 3 flights of stairs, come out high above an area, and then backtrack around to the bottom of the building again. Sometimes there's some buildings like that, and they actually work pretty well, but there's other ones that it just felt like you were lost in this space because there wasn't a good visual indicator. So a lot of that is just kind of playing through it and just this isn't really feeling right. Or the visual flow isn't working, and then finding like ways to try to encourage people to explore the nooks and crannies, the loot that will spawn, like a lot of times it's rings or traits or different things like that can spawn on a tile, and making sure that the system was like had enough to pull from to make it interesting. So there's tons of like rings and trinkets you can put on. So it really encourages players to do that, as well as picking up the scrap, which is what they use to craft. So I think that was the key thing too, of finding ways that encourage players to move through the tiles, that they knew where they were going, but also explore all the nooks and crannies.
Right on. I'm going to give a quick shout out in chat to Arslan20. Welcome. Thank you for dropping by. Let's move into how do you... So I think one of the interesting things about Soulsborne-inspired combat is that there's a really intense relationship with space alongside just sort of a standard dodge, parry, roll combo thing. If I'm watching Kotaku's highlight reel, for instance, I am either laughing because I'm watching someone who just rolled past an enemy attack, and then the enemy finished their attack and fell off a cliff, and that was what and that's just a side effect of the way space and combat interacting. Or there'll be a wild combo. If say it's a Dark Souls and there's an invasion going on, a player will randomly swing around a corner, and their invader will suddenly be caught on their weapon, for instance. Like those sound sort of straightforward to describe, but that's not how combat works in Horizon Zero Dawn. That's not how combat works in a lot of the other third-person action games I like. How did you make sure that in a procedural setting, like moments like that could either happen? I mean, I guess procedural sort of is a promise that lots of those moments will happen, but at the same time, it's also a possibility that none of those moments will happen because it's random like that.
Right. I mean, I think like the way we build it, they're basically like these tiles, and they're actually pretty big chunks of areas. So there's still level design that goes into each one of those, and I think that's the key to any like again Dark Souls or Bloodborne. They're meticulously like laid out to set up these scenarios where you could get the jump on somebody, or you're set up as a perfect spot to like, oh well, I can go over here and heal real quick. I think that's key, and I think that's comes through in some of the. It's almost like micro level design because the tiles are like still handcrafted, but the way that they're organized in the world is the procedural generation aspect of it.
Right on. And then I guess the next element of the question is talk about the multiplayer part. Unfortunately, I don't have any friends. No, that's true. I have friends. A lot of my friends don't play video games. It's just kind of a sad part of life. You can play, like you said, you can play Remnant from the Ashes with your friends, and your friends can hop into a session and navigate those same microtiles with you. Was there anything about filling a space for 4 chunky, beefy explorers that you all had to consider in that process?
Well, actually, it's 3. It's a 3-player co-op.
3 players. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's fine.
Got the number wrong.
But definitely. Like that's key in any time you test them out is to make sure that there's enough space for people to get to different places. I mean, there's a cover system technically. It's not like snap into cover, but you can duck behind cover, and we definitely consciously built a lot of these areas with that in mind. Of you can duck behind something, pop out, shoot something, and go right back into cover. So there has to be enough of those spaces for 3 people at any given point. Sometimes it's destructible, sometimes it's solid. So we like to change it up and like, hey, this cover was cover a minute ago, but now it's not because the enemy broke through it, or one of your friends hit it with their sword instead and they broke through it. So it does add this like level of interest of the kind of changing battlefield. As like there's a couple boss fights where you think you have cover, but then the boss does something and now you don't have cover. So there's definitely that aspect of it as well. And then making sure there's enough of that 3 people could get cover if they really wanted it, or there's enough positioning that they, 2 of them might be able to share cover and that kind of stuff. That comes into a lot of the 3-player co-op and setting up a level.
Right on. We've had a few more folks file into the chat room, so I'll just give a quick reminder. We would love to hear your questions for John if you've got them, and they're about Remnant from the Ashes. We want to bring them in. John, what else from a multiplayer perspective have you had to consider for as a design director? I do know that you mentioned I'm blanking on the name. I just had it up. The 4-player VR game that you all worked on, right? The one you mentioned earlier.
Oh yeah, From Other Suns. That was 3-player.
3-player also. Wow, I'm really getting that number mixed up today. Anyway, you mentioned that your studio has experience with 3-player co-op action games, but what else did you have to learn going into this game to make a game a genre known for working for 1 player work for 3 players?
I mean, really, like it's really just trying to find where that point of challenges and how to escalate that, and really like we wanted it to be good for both, and that's definitely like that's a high level goal, and I feel like we did a pretty good job nailing that, because I do think there's something to be said for being able to take a boss out by yourself, but there was also the thrill of doing it with a group of friends, and it's really just trying to find that right balance of that. And again, it's supposed to be a hard game, so it shouldn't be, the bosses aren't meant to be pushovers, so there's definitely a strategy to them, and trying to get around them and take them out. And then the dynamic changes obviously as you add more players to it. So it's just trying to find, it's really just like a lot of just checking out the field. Does this feel right, or does this feel overwhelming, or how does this scale? So like I said, the fights were designed 1, 2, or 3 people. So it's really trying to figure that balance out.
Right, so the game's often checking if how many players are in the scenario, and then it pulls up whatever it needs to, whatever you've designed to make it work for that scenario. I assume this may be a slightly dumb question, but I assume the answer to scaling for 3 players isn't just going to your spreadsheet of values and multiplying everything by 3, right?
No, definitely not. There's like we have an AI director that will come into play. So like it will spawn specific creatures. Hey, there's 3, so this has more of a likelihood to spawn this type of creature if there's 3 people, because this guy's going to be tougher than the guys that would spawn if it's 1 player. So there's that, and then the scaling of damage and scaling of enemy life, and there's a lot of factors that go into it.
Mm-hmm. I guess before we move on from this question, is there any particular factor that you all discovered was really useful to manipulate on that scale that you didn't realize when you went in? Was there any like, oh wow, if we change this, the experience gets a lot better, but we didn't think that would be the case when we started?
I think the manipulating of the spawn tables, I think, was probably the biggest one of just because it could get real messy real quick if you just have like a base enemy and you're like, well, if there's one player, you spawn two, and if there's three players, then you spawn 20, and then it's like that doesn't scale well. But just trying to find like that median ground, like that's something we kind of figured out on from other sons as well. Of just like, hey, when somebody jumps in by themselves, you don't want to fight like 5 brutes, but that might be okay, and yeah, if there's 3 people. So it's really trying to find that.
Right on. I think Bowser Bunch kind of has a question that's related to. He's kind of asking to build on this. What Bowser's asking, what was the design choice behind the bosses having lots of ads, which I think we just kind of talked about. I'm assuming by ads he means additional mobs.
Yep.
I guess that's a really like we can dig into that decision. To use extra enemies to scale bosses as opposed to other tools. Could you do you have any other thoughts about that?
I mean, one of the biggest things is there is ammo, which is definitely one of the challenges we ran into over time of how do you get ammo in the player's hands. I say maybe that's one of the things that changed the most in the last 6 months as we played, tested more and more of just figuring out like, how's the player get ammo, especially in a locked-in fight. We have several ways of doing that now. We have you can purchase ammo boxes for pretty cheap from Reggie at the base, so you can use that as an item. There's the cost of the animation of actually opening up the ammo box and getting the ammo out, much like the healing has a very specific frame count for while they're healing. And the big thing we ran into was like, not everybody's a great shot, and you end up spending a lot of shots on a boss that you miss, or they're not hitting the weak spot. So we decided the best way to go with that would be ads, because they do add a challenge, obviously, but they also make sure that you have plenty of health or have plenty of ammo coming out. So that's the big part of it. I think also like it forces players to, especially in multiplayer games, to kind of come up with jobs and or like a focus. Like, hey, I'll handle these guys. You focus on the boss, and it adds a lot of strategy to coordination with your team to be able to like, hey, I'm going to do this over here. You do this. So that was another major reason for doing that in multiplayer, but also making sure that the ammo was still plentiful during the boss fight, because you don't want somebody who's they're speccing out in range and they like a specific gun to be forced to just melee the boss like the last half of the fight. That's not necessarily fun. If you're trying to play a melee class, that's a different story. But if you're out of ammo and you're primarily shooting, then it kind of sucks. So that was a big part of it.
I like talking about jobs during boss fights. That reminds me of when I was playing World of Warcraft back in the day. On the Onyxia raid, like you'd as a paladin, like and one of the people with a decent amount of crowd control and area of effect, like you would be in pre-raid discussions. We would be discussing, okay, your job is to stun those ads coming in from the side, while obviously you have your straightforward tank and spank happening up front. That's a really cool conceit to like add more enemies as a means of like giving players more roles in the fight.
Yep.
Raging Ginger 99 would like to know what determines the difficulty of public games that they join. That's a good question, actually, because I assume different players want different difficulty levels. They say every time they join a game, it's on normal mode, never hard or nightmare. Raging Ginger, if and when I get back to this game and if you happen to see me online, rest assured I will always have the difficulty set on normal, never hard or nightmare.
What was the question? Sorry.
Oh, the question was what determines the difficulty of public games that they join?
Whatever the player decided to choose. So if you start a game and you decide to play in normal, which is the default setting, it will just when somebody joins your game, it'll be that difficulty. And then we've done some stuff with scaling as well. And I think it's in the last patch where basically a person we used to do it where if you were level 1 and someone joined your game and they were level 20, we would scale it up to 20. and we found that people didn't like that. So what we ended up doing was we put like a cap on that of like +3, so it would only go up to level 4 then, for the players who's hosting. So it's definitely a thing we're definitely keen on, making sure it feels fair, and then people can play with their friends.
Right on. Let's see. We're Arslan. I do see you have a question that you just threw in. We're gonna get back to viewer questions in a second, but we'd love to keep taking them. Just keep adding them in chat, and I will grab them. John, let's talk about adventure mode. It's not out yet. But you guys we were just talking before the stream that you were working on adventure mode. But apparently, and I'm going to go ahead and quote, I'll just say I'm quoting the lovely folks at PC Games to help me understand how this works. The idea will be that when you finish a playthrough, you can roll an instance of each component area within the game, and that way you can go specifically after weapons, items, bosses that you didn't see on your run. What are the challenges of implementing a mode like that and letting players sort of go on specific dungeon runs when you start off your game from a procedural generation standpoint?
It's actually didn't prove to be too difficult. It seemed like it was really just like making sure that it functioned. I know there's some work had to be done to the way that the world was being generated, because in adventure mode it doesn't hit the story beats. So some stuff in the game is dependent upon the story beats to progress to the next area. Being that it's a single biome, it meant that we had to make sure that it still worked. So you'll get a boss at the end, but you might not get like the same mini bosses in the same order that you would had a chance of doing in the normal mode. So I think that was basically the biggest thing, was making sure that it feels like something that's interesting, and it feels like a different take, and also is a way for people to specifically chase after items that they're looking for without having to re-roll the whole campaign.
That makes sense. That leads into the question sort of about live games. I like to ask game developers these days, because even though single-player games still have value, it feels like more and more players are making it clear to developers that even if a game is a single-player experience, they're hoping for updates or interaction with the team after the game launches. Like, a game isn't just a finished product now right when you get it out the door. There's a lifespan in a community that is meant to exist, especially for a game where players are meant to get together and fight monsters together in a game like this. What have been your thoughts about making sure that Remnant could be updatable and you would be able to add new content going forward after this?
Well, I definitely think that because it's procedurally generated, it actually works a little bit better. Like, we could theoretically drop in some content on Earth, for example, and if you re-roll the campaign or you re-roll adventure mode, you have a chance of seeing something new. So in those cases, that seems like pretty cool to me as a developer. Of like, hey, you know what? People really like Yeisha, for example, the last biome in the game. They would love to see more content. That's something we could consider at that point. As opposed to like maybe a normal single player game that's very linear in its story, that has very specific beats. It's a little harder to revisit places without them feeling tacked on. And because the whole loop of the game is really like reroll and try some different stuff or play with your friends and see something different, it doesn't feel alien. Whereas like if in Darksiders 3, if we were to add content like right in the middle of the story, it would feel weird in the story mode. But then it would require people to start a new game and play it from the beginning to the end to see that new content, which feels off, because that's not how that game was presented. It was presented as here's a linear story that you could New Game Plus and play through, but at the same time, to see the content, it is a little harder that way.
Yeah, that reminds me, there was a vague minute there in games where I remember Assassin's Creed 2 and Deus Ex Human Revolution both had DLCs that shipped that, like, when you were playing, if you bought the game when it launched, you just had a minute where the character said, hang on, like, there's a skip in Assassin's Creed 2, there was a skip in Ezio's Memories. In Deus Ex, Adam Jensen went on a ship, and then they slotted in missions later that were taking place during those gaps. So that's kind of, that's like you said, if you bought it at launch, you'd be stuck on replaying the game to get to those moments, and if you did not buy the game at launch, you might be okay. You might be better served. You might be having a better experience than the people who bought it at launch. So I guess supporting replayability makes sense then in that case.
Yeah, because that was the big thing is like I said, like the idea that it's a replayable game.
Hmm.
It's it's kind of a long game, but we've heard lots and lots and lots of people like, hey, I'm on my third reroll and I'm enjoying the campaign a lot. This is fun. I'm seeing new stuff. So just that like that the fact that the game is that is pretty exciting for us because that was the intent, and I'm glad people are seeing it like they're not seeing it like, oh, I finished it, I'm done. Where's more content? It's more like, oh, I didn't see all the content. I know that, so I'm going to go and try it again. So it's definitely that's exciting that it's working the way as it was intended.
Yeah. Arsenal 20, I will get to your question now. They would like to know what was the biggest difficulty you faced making this game? We've talked about how a lot of things weren't difficult, but I guess I'm curious what was difficult.
Um, Boy, I mean, every game has plenty of difficulties. I think the biggest thing for us was just, hmm, it's just there's a lot of content and making sure like I mean, this sounds generic, but like just wrangling everything to make sure everything worked together. I think actually, okay, let me back up on that. I think actually the biggest thing for me though I'd noticed was we had ways to test specific like quests or encounters that occur in the game, which is cool. It's like, oh, cool, I can see this encounter. This seems like it's working. Like we were able to do that. We had a lot of tools that let us just jump to specific spots in the campaign.
Hmm.
However, when it came to like, okay, before we ship, let's test the game out. There's no way to like force events to happen. So there's events like in the retail version I still haven't seen yet that I know are there, but they just haven't rolled in my world. So I think that might be the hardest thing is to see like, hey, does this actually work? Because it wouldn't show up. You know, you could do like 3 playthroughs and you might not get a specific thing you were hoping to get. So I think that might actually be one of the more difficult things is that testing content ended up being a little bit challenging that way. We got pretty lucky and were able to do a friends and family a couple weekends. So we had more people banging on it to see more of the events. So we were able to kind of like, hey, did that make sense when that showed up? Kind of get a little bit of a sense of how it feels when people play, and even like we had a little Discord for it as well, and people
Hmm.
would talk back and forth like, hey, did you see this? And like, no, I didn't see that, and then and just kind of you can kind of gauge like how often these things are spawning because they're like loot actually where they have a chance to spawn. So there's some events that have a very low chance to spawn, so you might not get them, and which is it's kind of a cool side effect. Is I'll see people like on forums or on different social media and say, hey, I just got this quest or this event. Anybody want to jump in my game that needs it? So that's kind of a cool thing. It's almost like, hey, I'm going to go run a dungeon in WoW. Is anybody up for it? Because they need some loot. So it's kind of cool to see
Yeah.
that kind of organically happen.
And it's not about and what's I love is that when you roll in the dungeon in WoW, if it's hey we need to run this, it's because you're trying to get that chance for that specific loot table to roll in WoW, right? Like the encounter is
Right.
always the same.
That's true.
You can maybe with a couple exceptions, and maybe this has changed in newer patches because I haven't played WoW since before 2010. Um, uh, um, in your game, players are looking for encounters. They're looking for content. They're looking for game content, which that's so cool that like just to hear that players are kind of banding up and looking together. Like, oh hey, it's like seeing a wild. I don't know. It's like seeing a weird animal out in the woods. It's like, hey guys, let's go come look at this weird animal together. That's a
Yeah.
very odd way to describe it, but that's a really cool thing to hear about. Following up on that, what I doubt this has happened because it sounds like you've had a pretty effective testing regimen. But what was kind of your guys' fear if you implemented some content and for whatever reason, as the drop, as the dice roll happened, or maybe there was a really hidden bug somewhere? What was your kind of fear if the game launched to retail and you tested everything you could, and then one event just wasn't appearing, and you were getting reviews and you were getting player feedback about everything, but like one or two events, and you just couldn't seem to find it anywhere? Maybe
I
that didn't
mean,
happen.
I don't didn't happen that I know of. I think people found pretty much everything that's actually in the content at this point, just because you have enough people playing, and it's just exponentially that number goes up compared to like our four internal testers and even our dev team that's under 70 people. So it's definitely like you've got thousands and thousands of people playing it day one. It's definitely a lot. You're going to hear if something's not there or if something's broken. So,
Hmm.
I mean, not saying we didn't ship without bugs. We've definitely been very diligent and very communicative as much as we can on pretty much all the social and forums that we can, and trying to track down stuff and doing patches.
Hmm.
So there's definitely I don't know. I definitely think like the system as I said, it was a little bit more matured from what we did from Other Suns. So there wasn't, I don't think there was any cases of like, hey, this just never showed up, because it's all still built into a chance table. There's stuff that, like I said, has very, very low chances to spawn, but at the same time, those are almost like, oh man, this is an epic event, because it has a rare chance to spawn, which is pretty cool.
Right on. Bowser Punch would like to know, is the quote "can of force an event to test it" issue something that will affect you post-release, or do you think your tools have evolved to the point that you'll be able to force whatever events you need? And I guess they're also asking if you plan to let players force events, which seems like something you wouldn't want.
Right. I mean, we can, like, if we have a dev build, we can always force events. It's more of just like playing, just like, hey, I'm gonna try to legitimately play this game, and then
Yeah.
not seeing the event is more of the challenge I felt we ran into a lot, where it's just like, hey, has anybody seen that? It's like, no, I haven't. And then somebody will force spawn in their build. I'm like, yeah, it works. So that is definitely one of the cases. But yeah, I don't think currently we don't have any plans to let players like forcefully spawn one, because I still think there's, like, we feel like that's the fun of the game, is like, what are you going to get? And then with adventure mode, that's meant to at least help people down, or at least focus a little bit more on a specific zone.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, I think, like, unless they're very active on forums or following the game very closely, a lot of people don't know what's out there. So I think so that, I mean, there's those people out there that will say, hey, I very specifically need this event to spawn, because this is the last piece of armor I need, or whatever it might be. But I think a lot of people are just having fun, like, oh wow, this is new, and I
Mm-hmm.
definitely think if people like a specific zone a lot, like they love ROM, you're like, hey, cool, just see what all ROM has to offer. Just keep playing adventure mode and ROM and seeing. And the nice thing is, I mean, you have your campaign character save, and you take that into adventure mode. It doesn't affect your current progress in your campaign. So you can go finish a couple adventure modes and go back to your campaign if you want, and keep that, everything you've taken or everything you've gotten from adventure mode comes back into your campaign.
Right on. John, I'm gonna step away specifically from questions about Remnant from a second. For everyone in chat, we would love to keep if you keep throwing your questions in chat, I will keep finding ways to ask them. But John, I want to move away from the design part of your title and into the title of director. As Remnant is kind of the studio's first, or it's been the Gunfire's made a bunch of VR games. It made Darksiders 3, so Remnant is kind of the first game that's sneaking into the unique AAA, like it's a first new IP AAA like standalone title for kind of something that was new and a little like this. What was your process for communicating with a team of, like you said, 70 people? Communicating effectively with your coworkers to get the vibe across, because obviously it's not just you sitting there magically making decisions. It's a whole talented team of people. But from the top down, what you think was effective about making Remnant happen as opposed to a different kind of game?
I definitely think that like our game director and our president, I mean, it's been his vision for a very long time. This is the
Mm-hmm.
kind of game he wanted to make for years. I mean, we basically started the studio to pretty much make this game. We tried, like I said, a couple different times, and we did like kind of a light version of it with From Other Suns.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely think that, like, just getting people to understand like what the intent is of, like, hey, you know what, this isn't a looter shooter. This is very much like an exploration, Dark Souls loot type of game. I think that was one of the bigger challenges, I think, early on, is like, well, why isn't there more loot? And it's like, that's really not the goal. It's really like finding, like, each piece of loot is supposed to be this unique, interesting thing that feels different than the other stuff to a degree. It's not like, hey, is this gun slightly better than this gun? Is this, oh, this is blue and this one's purple? It's really not that game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because so many shooters have gone that way, I think that's been the biggest hurdle, is like, even externally, like, a lot of people are saying, this doesn't look like it has enough loot to be a looter shooter. It's like, well, it's not supposed to be. So I think that's been the challenge, is because people are used to that. Like, you've got Division, you've got Destiny, you got Borderlands 3 coming out. It's very much like shooters now, aside from like Call of Duty and I mean, I guess Call of Duty's a little bit too, but like Call of Duty single player and Gears single player isn't as focused on getting loot. It's more about the gun and getting that gun, and this gun functions differently.
Hmm.
So you're not chasing different colors and different stats of like slightly better, this is slightly worse. Like you're not min-maxing the same gun over and over again. And then also the idea of like how the randomization would play along with a like a linear overarching story, and how much fun there is to be had in that idea. Like, because there's a lot of events that are super dependent upon each other that may spawn. Like there's the I can't remember what his name is. There's a guy with a one of the root masks. And then there's a tree that's basically talking to him. You could meet that guy but never find that tree, or you could find that tree and never meet that guy, or you could find him, take the mask from him forcefully, and go talk to that tree, and you can understand what it's saying. So I think, like getting that idea of like there's these little pocket circular encounters that have no bearing really, like on the linear story that stays the same, but there's these little side events, and how compelling that could be for people, I think was a big thing too. Is like you could say, hey, this is going to sound cool, right? And then people don't really get it until they actually play it and see, oh wow, yeah, I didn't get that, and that totally changed that experience.
Right on. That's really cool. What I'm curious, like to give your team, just to shine some light on your hardworking coworkers for a minute. What were some of the cool ideas that your team sort of surfaced? Obviously, that made its way into the event system.
I mean, a lot of the quest stuff, we're just like, hey, can we do this with this system? Let's try this, and like
Hmm.
pushing it to the sense of like, is it to push the system as far as it can go, and then in some cases like adding to that system. And again, like the root, or the guy with the root mask in the tree, that's a really funny one because it is so independent. And then there's Mudtooth, which is one of my favorite characters. And there's a little secret with him, if you do the right things, that will then impact like a boss later down the road, if you do those things. And I think those are just a lot of cool stuff that people found interesting ways to tie them together, and really make these little vignette narratives, just through the quest system, ended up being really cool.
Right on. So finally, my characters made it out of the tutorial, as we can see. So we're finally getting to get some live gameplay footage to talk about. We're about halfway through the honor. Raging Ginger just wants to toss in that Mudtooth loves his stew. I haven't met Mudtooth yet. I assume John knows exactly what Mudtooth and his stew is all about. I guess I'm curious, like, now that we're getting to watch me do a little rootin' tootin' combat, we can go to Bowser Punch's question, which is, what was kind of, what did you learn? They're asking, they're stating something I'm not sure is a fact, so I'm gonna skip it, which is, but I will ask, how did Darksiders 3, which is kind of a game, that was an existing franchise you were sort of building to existing design pillars, how did that game influence Remnant from the Ashes?
I mean, it's kind of hard to say. There's like some ways that we kind of learned, like, it almost affected it more from a tool standpoint. There's such different
Yeah.
teams in a lot of ways. I mean, we actually started on Remnant before Darksiders 3 was even a thing. And I think it
Hmm.
was when we were working on From Other Suns, we started like early preliminary stuff. Remnant's been definitely in development for quite a while. I mean, we figured out I think from an art standpoint, like some of the stuff that works and doesn't work
Hmm.
in Darksiders, and we were able to kind of apply a lot of those as we finished up some of the post-apocalyptic city stuff, because we always seem to do that. A post-apocalyptic city is kind of like our bread and butter for a lot of our games.
Hmm. Right on. Let's dig in. Let's lean into the tools about that. Like, what do you think makes what do you think is essential about the tools that you brought into Remnant? That were honed by your work on From Other Suns and these other games. What do you think it was about these tools that enabled Remnant to be possible?
I mean, really, the procedure generation thing, probably number one.
Hmm.
Being able to set that up and the interface for it, and making that whole system work was super key in FOSS. Or, sorry, from other sons we always call it FOSS internally because it's a mouthful.
Yeah.
But a lot of that stuff coming over, and then identifying like, well, how would you do this on a larger scale? Because again, like I said, it was usually like a space station or a spaceship. So how would you make a city out of this, or how would you make a much more cohesive campaign out of this? And finding refining those tools, the event trees for how you interact with characters. We did a lot of like the dialogue options, like we have in Remnant. We had a little bit in Darksiders, but a lot of it was the same stuff we did in From Other Suns. So like finding ways to refine that system and really like make it a lot more robust, and what can we add to this system? I'm trying to think what else. And I guess like one thing that we learned a lot from on Darksiders 3 was just the cinematics tools. We're still kind of early days for a lot of Darksiders, and we got updates because we use Unreal. So they were updating that system, the sequencer system, as we were working on Darksiders 3. So we don't have a lot of cutscenes in Remnant compared to Darksiders, but we did actually learn a lot. We were able to kind of refine our workflow throughout the process of Darksiders 3, and then applying a lot of that stuff to Remnant as we finish that up.
Right on. Teen Zoom would like to know if there are any plans for skins for players.
It's definitely something we talked about. We have the system in place we did pre-order skins. So there are some if you pre-order the game, but we're definitely looking at like how we want to do that system of like would they be unlocked on missions, or would they be found in the world? Like trying to figure that system out. But it's definitely possible.
Right on. I'm gonna loop back into my own question pool and talk about those vignettes you talked about earlier. When Remnant from the Ashes is moody, Remnant from the Ashes definitely has a like perspective about where this world is and what it's like for its characters. But when you're telling stories in games, there's always the challenge of what happens when your player's most useful verb for interacting with the world is shoot or slash. Like you've seen me, for instance, like I walked up to that house earlier and smacked on the door to try and get in because I thought the door might be breakable. It wasn't, and then I was worried if the banging of my hatchet would attract the monsters nearby. And that's an interesting small narrative moment, but it's not. But it's sort of emergent as opposed to something you guys were crafting. What have you all learned about making those moments that we mentioned? We've now mentioned Mudtooth and others. What have you learned that's effective about storytelling in this world when your players are mostly focused on danger and survival and such?
I think really just getting their goals in front of them fast as possible. So we try to, like, some people love talking to the NPCs, and that's great because I think all the voice actors did an amazing job. There's a lot of interesting lines there for people that are looking for the lore. But I mean, one thing we try to do is like, hey, you know what? Some people come to this just to shoot stuff. So like streamlining, like if you just click through talking to NPCs, we just get you through that a lot faster. I mean, that's one thing we learned was like there's some people in the studio like I just want to get back to the shooting. Just let me make this. I have to click through too many things. Let's get through that. I think that's the one thing that I think it's a challenge for telling an interesting story because some people just want to play that way, and it's like you just have to assume that they're not interested no matter what story you're telling. But then also we wanted to make sure that there was these story elements. We kind of followed like a lot of things in the game. We followed the Dark Souls path of there's weird NPCs you can talk to, and you can get some information from them. A lot of them are kind of like later in the game. A lot of them get more cryptic and a little bit stranger, and we wanted that like feeling of like, well, I really don't know. I am in another world right now. I don't know what they're talking about exactly, or I kind of understand what they're talking about, but I don't know if they're telling me the truth. And then also we spread a lot of lore throughout the world in like the Dark Souls way of doing it on items, but then also you can find diaries and some computer terminals in some of the human bases, and then you actually are basically the crux of the game is pretty quickly you learn that you need to find this guy named Founder Ford, who is like one of the founders of the Ward 13, which is where you're hanging out at the very beginning of the game. But you basically go to his hideout, is where the city section you just played here started. And you find notes and diaries from him throughout the game, and you're kind of like seeing that you're basically retracing his steps throughout the game, and kind of like his perspective. And you get to read his perspective on it. You're like, oh, I saw that too. That's interesting. That's how he felt about that. So I think like we wanted to make lore and interesting story that people, when they came to the game, if they wanted, they could seek it out. But we didn't want to do a lot of cutscenes and force people to like sit through like, oh, I'm not interested in the story, I just want to shoot. Let me just smash through this. So we made it more of an optional path.
Right on. There was a follow-up. Oh, I actually wanted to point out, this is actually the building that made me realize, this is the building that made me go, oh, wow, like, this game feels special. The window that I just am walking by right now, a couple seconds ago, I ducked into that building to try and sort of force the enemies to Congo line a little bit so I could take them out more easily. And one of them attacked me through the window and broke the glass, and then proceeded to climb through the window. And as a not very good Soulsborne player, and as a like attempting to try and get this footage for today player, like the little oh shit I had in my head was just that strange little detail that made me go, oh, this is really doing something for me right now. Man, I got so confused by this checkpoint here, because the icon came up. I walked up to this door and pressed square, and all my normal game logic for trying to get through wasn't working, so I moved on. I was not sure what was going on here.
Yeah, so that's a backtrack door. So basically, it's kind of telling you like, hey, there is a, if you look at the map, there is a there's a checkpoint there for sure. But it's again like a Souls game would do. You kind of make your way forward around, and then you loop back, and then you basically open that door. So now you have a shortcut back through the area.
Yeah, I guess the stop sign right there should also have been a clue that I needed to stop. Anyway.
Yeah, it's locked on the other side, basically, is the...
Yeah. Teen Zoom, those are some great questions you were asking. However, they also are kind of spoilery, so I'm going to hold off on those for our players who may not have gotten as far as you have. I would also, for that kind of question, I would suggest dropping by the Gunfire Games Discord. I assume you guys have a Discord, right?
Yep, it's discord.gg/remnant game.
Yeah, I'd love to get your question answered, but I bet they'll have better answers to you over there for that kind of question. Moving back, let's talk. We haven't really dug into combat. John, what do you think makes you're about to watch a combat encounter where I get my ass kicked eventually, but what do you think makes good, like, how do you design good combat from a top down as a studio? Like, how do you just sort of go looking at Soulsborne and go, okay, that's great, but we need to make our own thing, as opposed to just sort of copying and pasting Soulsborne?
Right. I mean, obviously, like, you can't copy and paste directly since they don't make a shooter version. Right. So I mean, honestly, what we do really is we look at successful games and games that feel good and see what they're doing, and really like just take it apart piece by piece and see, like how many frames are they in the roll for, and how many iframes are there when you do roll, how fast when you go into aim down sights does it go, and we spend a lot of time like just getting that stuff feeling good, and just polishing that over and over and over again of like, is it snappy enough, does it feel responsive? I think that's really key. Like, I think you can make a shooter pretty easily, but making a shooter that feels good definitely takes a lot of time. And we found like that over time of like, hey, you know what? It's technically a third-person shooter, cool, but then we just like doesn't feel as good as this game or that game. So we would just like, well, what are they doing that makes it feel right? So it would just be a lot of like kind of A to B of like, okay, well, they're doing this, and then they're doing it for this reason. Does this feel? They're doing this because they want this responsiveness here. So it's like, okay, cool. We should look into doing that and see how we put that in our game, or the weapon switching, like how long does that actually take, and things like that, like where we've like really like I guess hemmed and hawed over like very like over frame counts like pretty meticulously like throughout the course of the development of like this is just a little too long here, or this is this is quick, this feels good, and just like the responsiveness. I think that's the biggest thing is from a player standpoint, like making sure that the player is feeling like their character is doing what they want them to do at any given point, because you don't want them to feel like, well, I told it to do this and it didn't do this, so it's the game's fault. So I think like a lot of people, when you make a responsive game, they realize, oh, I died because something I did. The game did what I told it to do, and I died. Um,
That
and I think, and also like I think a big part of it too for us was the to make the shooting feel good, especially is making sure that the impacts feel good on enemies. Because I mean, if you're going through a shooting gallery and guys aren't responding when you shoot them, it just doesn't feel good. You want to see like just really just they're taking hits and they're kind of snapping. The shots feel like they have impact to them. A lot of the characters will have specific directional impact. So if you shoot them in the shoulder, they kind of flail back, or like the little root hollow guys will you hit them and they kind of roll backwards. So there's just like getting that like moment to moment, like as you shoot guys, get that responsiveness on the enemies to make it feel like, hey, that felt good. It feels like a little reward every time you shoot them, and you're like, ah, got them, and then they respond. Like you can shoot guys, these guys like they'll like lurch over. When you shoot them in the legs, they could fall over. So hey, that's a strategy where it's like you shoot them in the legs, they'll fall forward, and then you can take them out while they're on the ground, and just giving players that like responsive feedback constantly, I think, is a key to like making shooter gameplay feel fresh and keep them interested.
Right on. We're coming up on the end of the hour. If any folks have any questions for John, we would love to get them in before we wrap up for the day. John, this has been a really great chat. I feel like I've learned a lot about how Remnant was made. If there are any key, is there anything, something that happens to me when I'm working on a big project? Is there something that I learn and realize, and like I swear I have to go tell it to every person, like don't go, like basically kind of like either don't go here, this is a big danger zone warning of working on this kind of project, or if you use this will save you so much time. Is there anything like that for you on this game? Is there anything you'd like your fellow developers to know about when working on their own Soulsborne guns alikes? You guys are the gun. You guys are the Soulsborne's Remnant alikes.
Oh boy.
Anyway,
nobody ever says that in real life.
No,
That's a mouthful.
You just heard me stammer through it.
Oh man. I mean, I feel like it really don't be afraid to just spend the time on the stuff that's really important. Like I said, we've worked on this game for quite a while, and it, like, for a very long time, it was really just like getting the game loop in and making sure that felt tight. And it's like once you have that, like everything else can kind of fall into place. Like if you're making a shooter and it's not fun to shoot things, then focus on that. Don't worry about like the story or the quests or the world design, because I mean people come to shooters first and foremost to play a shooter. If the guns don't feel good, it's not gonna feel good. I mean, the same thing goes for we have a melee system in the game as well, so it had a lot of refinement too in the last couple months. That it should feel good. If you're gonna have something in the game, like, make sure it feels good and don't half-ass and be like, this will be fine, because it really won't. Players will tell you very, very quickly, like, this doesn't feel good. And it's really just like being able to just take the time to focus on what's important, like figure out what's the most important thing in here, and then let the time that you have be focused on getting those things good.
Right on. We actually did have some questions come in here at the end, so I'm gonna grab these. They're all kind of based around what future updates for the game, so I'm gonna group them together. I'll just say these come from Raging Ginger, Teen Zoom, and Dark Willie 90. The basic, I guess the starting question would be, is there any plans to like release a roadmap to help players know what's next for Remnant, which is a more popular thing with devs these days, public roadmaps?
Yeah, maybe. It's really like we're trying to figure it out ourselves of like what we want to do. Obviously, we want to keep supporting the game because the community's just been awesome. And it's I have to say, like the positive comments about the game has just been like overwhelming. It's been really awesome that I don't know, I wasn't expecting that level coming out of the gate. I think everybody here knew we had something special, but it was just a matter of like, how do you launch a new IP shooter in 2019? Like it seemed like an insurmountable task, and I guess because of that, like we're looking at like, well, what's the best way to support the game? So, I mean, we might have some loose stuff in the coming weeks to talk about. Obviously, adventure mode's around the corner. We don't have a set date on that, but it should be very soon. We're testing it currently, so it's soon, and then we should have something else hopefully soon after that. But yeah, we just need to figure it out kind of and see like what's possible, and where doing patches are a lot easier if it's like, hey, we're doing some balance or we're just tweaking this, we're fixing bugs. That stuff's a lot easier, and a lot of times you don't want a roadmap for that necessarily because it's kind of hard to tell what's going to go in. But from a content standpoint, we definitely want to support the game ongoing. But it's just a matter of like figuring out like what that looks like and when we're ready to talk about it.
Right on. And do you think, just to give that kind of covers a bunch of questions in there, but just to give Raging Ginger a little something to leave with, do you think there'd be any plans to expand the list of public games to say what world the player is in, or what difficulty they are, or what the ping response on the server would be?
I mean, all those things are possible. I don't know why I mean, it's just a matter of like, again, we're relatively a small team, and even for 70 people, we're a really small programming team. So those folks are just like superheroes to be able to like support all the stuff we do. But it's definitely a case of like, yeah, that's something we could definitely look into. There's a lot of stuff we want to look into. It's just getting the time in there, and like first priority is like addressing crashes people are having, or kind of like any kind of stuff that stops their game. I think we're getting to a good point with a lot of that stuff now. At this point, a lot of it's balance and like just refinement and making sure the game's a lot more stable for people. But it's definitely we can look at exposing more stuff to people as we go on, for sure.
Right on. Well, just as my character sits down at the campfire to take a rest, I am going to also go sit down at a metaphorical campfire. Thank you all for watching the GDC Twitch channel today. We would love it if you clicked the follow button. If you do, you will get notifications when we go live, and we are trying to talk to a lot of cool developers this year. There are so many games coming out, and there are so many great developers to talk to, John among them. We are trying to get the folks from Control in here, from Remedy, so hopefully that happens. I need to follow up with them, but we've been talking for a couple weeks now. Big thanks to John for coming on today. Big thanks to all the folks who helped get the stream together. John, you already mentioned the Discord. If they've got questions for you about making shooters like this, where should they ask them?
I mean, I'm always on the Discord, and so are a lot of the other devs. But yeah, that's probably the best way to just jump in there, or follow me on Twitter for random stuff at pfunkpearl.
Right on. And for my part, for GDC's part, if you yourself are interested in how games get made, we'd like to encourage you to check out everything from the GDC Vault to the GDC YouTube channel. If you are a developer yourself, we would love to have you at GDC next year. And if you're a developer who has a good talk in mind for making games, we would like you to know that the summits, the GDC summits, are now taking their calls for submissions. So there's a whole bunch of different summits. It's narrative, it's AI, it's community management, it's audio. If you work in any of those specific areas, we'd love to hear your talks. And with that, John, I'm just going to share one nice note for you from Dark Willie. Dark Willie wants to thank you for taking time to talk to the community.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great, and hopefully people enjoyed it.
Right on. With that, I wish you all have a good day, have a good afternoon where you are in the world, and goodbye.
Bye.